And Anna, can you also live stream this too? You can live stream it to my page or Our Honors Facebook page.
Sure.
Cool. All right.
Hello,
everyone.
Setting up the live stream. 1 second. Just giving everyone a second to join. We have a live stream on our Facebook right now, and we're recording this. But hope everyone's having a good morning. My name's Anastasia, by the way. Crystal is at work. I think the other Our Honor page is her, but she is not able to be fully present right now. So I'll just be leading us in here. Also, if you didn't see on our Instagram anybody or just see in general, Crystal is just one of the 50 people that was shouted out by Vox for her work with Our Honor, and she's our executive director, the founder. But yeah, from this year's Future Perfect 50. So a really exciting article if you want to check that out. Really, she's an amazing person in my opinion. But yeah, go ahead and check that out if you'd like. But we'll get started. Thank you for coming. If you're trying to get CE credit for this, make sure to be watching and participating with the live lecture. The recorded lecture won't be able to get you your credit. In order to ensure you get this credit, you'll have to fill out the course survey. The link to Vox was just posted in the chat, but I'll post the link to this as well for the survey that you'll have to do just to make sure you get your credit. If you missed the link or if you need the survey sent to you, you email info@ourhonor.org if you need this, or if you have any other questions, that's just info@ourhonor.org. But as you watch this lecture, feel free to post questions in the chat. We do want to keep these CEs free and accessible to all. So if you're able to donate, please do. We have a Venmo account at Our Honor, or you can go to ourhonor.org.venmo, or sorry, ourhonor.org/donate. Anyways, to go into this, Dr. Jeremy Marchant is the recently appointed chief scientist with the Organic Plants Trust. He has researched welfare and behavior of pigs and dairy cattle for 33 years. Following his PhD on gestating sow welfare in Professor Don Broom's group at the University of Cambridge Veterinary School. He has worked mainly in the United Kingdom for 11 years and the United States for 22 years, with research stays in Denmark and Canada. His major research interests have included social and maternal behavior of sows, the manipulation of pig behaviors by diet, factors including influencing piglet mortality and environmental enrichment in intensive pig production. He also has a major interest in the development of novel indicators of animal welfare and in supporting animal welfare science and scientists in less developed countries. He has published 4 books and 260 referred articles and abstracts on farm animal welfare. He was the inaugural specialty chief editor. Sorry, I am having trouble today. I apologize. For the Animal Behavior and Welfare section of Frontiers in Veterinary Science, and is a past president of the International Society for Applied Ethology. A major part of his new role will be updating the GAP certified standards of the Global Animal Partnership Welfare Appearance Scheme. There is a speak tomorrow No. Anyways, so go ahead, Jeremy.
Great. Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure to be here talking to you. So this is a talk that I gave in the summertime at the International Society for Applied Ethology conference. We're lucky enough there to have open philanthropy funding to bring in scientists from developing countries, some of whom are the national focal points for animal welfare with World Organization of Animal Health. And what we did find that when we were bringing them in initially to the conference, some of those did not have a real grounding in the science of animal welfare. And so what we began to do was to bring them in a day early, basically, and have a fairly intensive workshop with them on the day before the conference started, so that they could get more out of the content of the conference. So basic outline of this talk is I'm going to go into, the history of animal welfare, the science within animal welfare. How do we define it? How can we measure it, both experimentally and then on farm, which poses quite different sets of parameters that we can work around. Oops, go the wrong way. So animal welfare, there's a number of definitions. Here's one from World Organization of Animal Health. In that animal welfare means the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions in which it lives and dies. So originally, of course, the OIE, or the World Organization of Animal Health, were very much set up to tackle health and disease across borders within different countries. Since I'm not sure how many years back, they started including, within the terrestrial code, they started including chapters on animal welfare. And so these chapters really give kind of recommendations on how member countries should be treating animals within animals of different species, and what we should be doing in order to sort of try and improve welfare. And so it has to be signed off on, and it's currently about 182 member countries. The number of member countries varies slightly, but it's basically all the countries in the world that sign off on it, including, of course, the USA. And we know that animal welfare is very important across cultures. This is work that I've been involved in with Dr. Michelle Sinclair as the lead on this, and we have managed to survey people in a whole lot of different countries on different continents, and asking them about whether the welfare of both farm animals and companion animals in my country is important to me. And invariably we find that just about in every country, even those where we might consider that welfare is not so important, we're finding over 3/4 of the people within these countries agree that welfare is important, and that includes farm animals as well as companion animals. In some countries do see slight differences, and in fact in places like Sudan, Bangladesh, which are heavy Muslim countries, and obviously struggle quite a bit with poverty and food security, we're finding in those countries, and Nigeria as well, we've got 3 countries there that consider welfare of farm animals more important than welfare of companion animals. But generally we're pretty high across the board. So in terms of history, the scientific discipline of animal welfare is relatively new, but of course good treatment of animals is not. It's an important belief in some religions and civilizations, dating back thousands of years. You think about the concept of ahimsa in various religions. The first known legislation to protect animals in terms of anti-cruelty type legislation, there was the 1635, so we're going back nearly 400 years in Ireland, prohibited ploughing by the tail and pulling the wool off living sheep. And then actually in 1641 over here in Massachusetts colony, no man shall exercise any tyranny or cruelty towards any brute creature which are usually kept for man's use. So we've got a couple of examples there of protection being put into place for animals within a legal framework. But then we have to move forward a kind of couple of hundred years. We had anti-cruelty legislation within the UK, updated over time in that 19th century. We had the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals founded in 1824. ASPCA was founded in 1866. US, we got Humane Slaughter Act in 1958, and of course the Animal Welfare Act in 1966, which of course does not cover farm animals. We still don't have federal level legislation for farm animals here. And then EU level legislation really started up in 1974. And in some ways, legislation at the EU level has really then taken the lead from that point onwards in terms of safeguarding welfare within a legislative framework. So why do we need to start thinking about putting protections in place? I mean, if you ask the general public about what they think about farming, they still have this idea that animal farming is this kind of utopia, almost this ideal types of systems, you know, animals out on green pasture. Of course, what we have seen is a lot of intensification, particularly post Second World War. And when you look at history, you can see that in terms of production, agricultural production has doubled. You know, it took 100 years to double first time, 70 years, 15 years, 10 years. So we've seen this ramping up, almost exponential increase in the doubling of production. And when I go to animal science type conferences, you can always guarantee that at some point, some speaker is going to get up and say, with a projected increase in population, global population to grow to 9 billion by 2050 or whatever the figure is, we need to ramp up production. You know, there's still that talk that we need to be ramping up animal production to meet that increased demand. I would always say the first thing we actually need to do is to decrease wastage. When we think across the whole of the food chain, we probably have 30–35% wastage of food. You know, if we actually tackled that before we tackle anything and made inroads in that, we wouldn't have to ramp up production at all for the foreseeable future. And so, like any of you, you know, when I fly across the US, you look out of the window, you know, the landscape in different parts of the country is dominated by these kind of scenes. And you know, when you fly, it's very, very hard to kind of determine, unless you know what you're looking for, the difference between the types of livestock production units that we have. You know, this one is a dairy unit. Probably you can only really tell that by the fact that it's got this bit here, which is the milking parlor. And usually they'll have silage on the dairy farm as well. You know, obviously the total mixed ration that is fed to the cows within the buildings. Typical kind of poultry unit that you would go over in places like Georgia, Arkansas, those kind of areas of the country. Out west, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, places like that. Sometimes we see these kind of operations. So this, of course, is beef cattle. Okay, they're not housed indoors, but it is still very definitely intensification, as you can see. So this one, for example, 150,000 capacity maybe. We've got 700 plus pens of about 200 cattle in each pen. You can just about see here, you know, that is a single pen with probably about 200 cattle in. So again, we see these real concentrations of animals. Beef, like I say, are the only ones that are really not housed indoors, are housed outdoors. And then we see a typical swine unit as well. You know, again, we will see these intensive farms with an accompanying manure lagoon next to them. So very, very similar. Lots of animals housed indoors in long, narrow, white buildings. As you fly, you know, you can see them all over the country, basically. In terms of history, again, where livestock production is growing, in some places, you know, it hasn't expanded particularly rapidly. When you think about North America and Europe, we haven't necessarily seen an awful lot of growth, certainly from here, kind of 1980, 1990 onwards. Where we've seen this really big growth lately is within Asia. And a lot of intensification going on at the moment within Asia in particular. And of course, China, you know, it's a bit of a numbers game. You know, when you think about where open philanthropy are putting money in terms of trying to address intensification and trying to reverse intensification, a lot of their investment right now is going into Southeast Asia, into those countries like India and China, where we've got huge populations of people and indeed huge populations of animals. And if you want to make real impact, if you can decrease, for example, you know, the number of pigs that are being housed intensively by 10% in China, you're making a huge impact on a global scale if you can do that in certain countries. You know, and this is China again. So when we think about intensification, you know, maybe this is kind of almost the ultimate intensification. Here is a multi-story swine unit in the stage of construction here. I think I counted the numbers. Basically, we're looking at about 27 to 30 levels of, you know, housing within this one building on this one footprint. And if you can imagine the size of the slurry lagoons needed for, you know, our units over here on flat land, when you think the amount of manure that is coming out of something like this and how that's going to be handled, I really don't know how it's going to be handled, but it's, yeah, you know, it's intensification on another scale. So intensification, you know, was the big factor that has started, I guess, I hope, the push in the opposite direction. So within the UK, we had this very influential book that was published by Ruth Harrison back in 1964, you know, which seems an awful long time now. We're going back 60 years. Ruth Harrison was not a scientist, but she had just been thinking about intensification. She visited lots and lots of farms, and she wrote a book basically outlining the state of British agriculture at that time. And it was a real eye-opener for the general public. It was serialized in a major UK paper, and it led to public outcry. And very quickly, the government at the time, they established a committee, as governments are good at doing, to have a look at the whole issue of animal agriculture. And very quickly, there was the beginning of some protective legislation happening. This one, the Agriculture Miscellaneous Provisions Act. The Bramble Committee was an extremely important committee in terms of its output and then its subsequent impact when we think about it across time and across the world. But this book by Ruth Harrison was a real, really lit the fuse for this change to happen. And you can still get this book, and it's very relevant. They put out a kind of anniversary edition with the original text, and then with some extra text chapters written in by, you know, welfare scientists, including Bernard Rollin in there, Don Broom, who's my PhD advisor, Marion Dawkins, David Fraser. So a lot of the high up animal welfare scientists, you know, talked about the impact of this book and its content. And it's, like I said, still hugely relevant. If you get a copy and read it, you know, you'll wonder, well, what has actually happened in the last 60 years? You know, here's one of the quotes out of the book. Most people tend to be ignorant of the processes by which food reached their table. Still absolutely true to this day. People still have no real idea of where their food comes from. And Ruth called for a ban on battery cages, veal crates, sow tethers, slatted floors. So all those things then that were indicative of very intensive production, they're still in use today, 60 years later. So even though she was calling, you know, we haven't seen anywhere near the amount of progress that we should have done in the last 60 years. So that Bramble Committee was set up. Here is what it was tasked with: to examine the conditions in which livestock are kept under systems of intensive husbandry and to advise whether standards ought to be set in the interests of their welfare, and if so, what should they be? So these kind of committees will tend to have, scientists on them, they will have producers on them, they will have lay people on them, a good mix of people to investigate the evidence and come up with some recommendations. Within this report, so it's dated 1965, as we see, they're talking about welfare in pretty modern thinking terms, in fact, that welfare is a wide term that embraces both the physical and mental well-being of the animal. So 60 years ago, we were talking about, or this committee was talking about welfare, including that mental aspect. And so any attempts to evaluate welfare must take into account scientific evidence concerning feelings. That's, again, that language within that report is something that, again, should be revisited and taken into account, because for a long time we really got away from that. We got bogged down, if you like, into the very, very hard science, and the hard science always said that feelings cannot be objectively measured, and so we shouldn't be looking at things like that. But it's funny how it's kind of come round full circle in the last 60 years, and now feelings and that mental state of the animals is something that's very definitely being given a lot of attention. And so animals show unmistakable signs of suffering. That's an important word being used there as well, from pain, exhaustion, fright, frustration, and so forth. The better we are acquainted with them, the more readily we can detect these signs. Judgment of the severity of their suffering must be subjective. So they're alluding to the point that it's very difficult to objectively measure these things, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be measuring them. If we are, then the severity must be subjective, and we should take that into account. At the end of this, there was Appendix 3, and this was really the start of the science side of animal welfare. This part was authored by one of the members of the committee, William Homan Thorpe, another Cambridge professor. And William Homan Thorpe was, in fact, the major advisor for Professor Don Broom, who was the world's first professor of animal welfare, and who was my PhD advisor. So, William Thorpe was Don's PhD advisor. And he was really, he was a zoologist. So, into ethology, which is the study of animal behavior, and not necessarily, of course, in farm animals, but he began working in farm animals, working with poultry especially. And he was emphasizing this importance in this appendix of the link between behavior and stress, which is really where we started seeing that evolving animal welfare science, and pain and discomfort. So some of those pain is more of a physiological measure, but discomfort is certainly, beginning to take in psychological components as well, as is pain. And so, like I say, in some ways, we kind of got a bit lost, between the Bramble Committee and where we are now. Science kind of went off on a bit of a tangent, I feel. And it does continue to be debated in terms of how we define it, what it should include, and how we can accurately assess it. Firstly, of course, it's not animal rights. Welfare is different to animal rights. Over here, you do tend to find that there's, certainly some confusion with that, either on purpose or not. If you work in animal welfare, you're quite often labelled with the fact that you must be animal rights, and not necessarily the case, of course. And so Don's, like I say, a lot of the scientists, we're trying to define, and a lot of the effort went into defining welfare rather than getting on and kind of measuring it. Don Broom's definition: the welfare of an individual is a state as regards its attempt to cope with its environment. He initially was very much thinking about welfare in terms of coping, in terms of responding to stress, and kind of being able to measure those behavioral and physiological systems as an animal is put under stress. Ian Duncan was definitely a little bit different in his thinking, that animal welfare is to do with the feelings experienced by animals, the absence of strong negative, the presence of positive. So this idea of suffering and pleasure. Like I said, we've seen this bit of World Organization for Animal Health talking about the mental state and physical state. Animal experiences good welfare if it's healthy, comfortable, well nourished, safe, not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear, distress, able to express behaviors. Within that, if you're really knowledgeable, you'll begin to see this idea of those 5 original freedoms, which we'll come on to. And so for a while, we had kind of almost 3 schools of thought, who the other one being this idea that welfare is all about natural living, how close to nature is important for welfare. And we had these 3 in some ways overlapping at times, but people were kind of putting themselves into one school of thought or the other. I think now we've moved towards this middle point in that everyone's thinking is coming together with the idea that welfare probably as a whole can mean all of these things combined. So we're beginning to kind of sit in this middle section of overlap. So 5 freedoms I just mentioned, those original 5 freedoms were these within the Bramble report, that an animal should at least have sufficient freedom of movement to be able without difficulty turn around, groom, get up, lie down, stretch limbs. So this is what was talked about in terms of those original 5 freedoms, purely those behavioral things of what the animal can do. That changed over time. It got worked on. The Farm Animal Welfare Advisory Council, or FAWAC as it was in the UK at that point, they worked on it a bit more, and especially one of the members, John Webster, and came up with this idea that 5 animal freedoms are the freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury and disease, freedom to express normal behavior, freedom from fear and distress. And like I say, John Webster was the one who worked on this the most, started publishing his own version of the 5 freedoms and how these 5 provisions might meet or be addressing those 5 freedoms. If we think about, I won't read through them all, but if we think about freedom from thirst, hunger, and malnutrition, how do we get there? By providing ready access to fresh water and a diet to maintain full health and vigor. So each of these freedoms can be met by provisions. Here are those provisions again, and to what end will those provisions work on the animal? Well, they will work by, basically giving us these welfare aims. We're going to minimize thirst and hunger, enable eating to be pleasurable. We're going to minimize that discomfort, minimize health and disease, minimize threats on unpleasant restrictions on behavior, and promote positive things, promote comfort, pleasure, interest, confidence, sense of control. So again, these 5 freedoms have been worked on more, and so now within the literature you might come up with this, the 5 domain model, really kind of worked on by David Mellor in New Zealand. So very similar to the freedoms, but with the idea that maybe there's more kind of interconnection with them. So if we're thinking, you can see where they come from in terms of those 5 freedoms: freedom from thirst and hunger within nutrition, freedom from discomfort within that environment, freedom from illness, health, freedom to express behavior, freedom from fear and stress. It's kind of rearranged it, I guess, and taken that mental domain to kind of sit below the other 4, and so that they're all tying in together. That's just the same thing again, 5 freedoms, but again kind of showing the linkages between them. And then overall, we're thinking about that welfare state of the animal. We're seeing all these inputs going into improving that mental state is very much at the forefront now, really the joining point of all these things, really emphasized, and that the welfare state, very, very important for that welfare state is that mental state of the animal. So things have certainly changed from the early days. Well, in terms of assessment, as scientists, we're pretty good at, carrying out our controlled experiments and getting lots and lots of different measures from individuals, because that becomes extremely difficult when we think about the size of the operations that we have now, especially within the US. The inside of a typical broiler house, the inside of a typical battery cage system. How are we ever going to, when welfare is such an individual experience, how on earth are we going to get a handle on the welfare of individuals within systems of this kind of size? That's still very, very tricky to get our head around. So at any one time, we can see that welfare exists on a continuum, that welfare is going to range from very good to very poor. Over the short term, when we think about it over a lifetime, we might think about, if it's very poor, it's a life not worth living. Adequate, can be a life worth living. Very good can be a good life. Ideally, we're going to be giving our animals something up the top end, but very often we are also giving our animals something down the bottom end, especially if we think about the broiler industry in particular, the way it is set up at the moment with our fast-growing breeds of chicken. Going back to William Homan Thorpe's appendix, he made a big case, not surprisingly, as an ethologist, as a behaviour person, he made a big play on behaviour. And of course, that's one of the most easy ways that we can begin to look at and measure the welfare of individuals. And in some ways, everyone can be a kind of ethologist anyone who has animals is a kind of amateur ethologist for sure. If you have a pet dog, you're pretty in tune with that animal's behavior to give you an understanding of the welfare of your dog. And so a lot of behavioral indicators that we have, how much of the behavior or their natural behavioral repertoire can be performed. We're looking at hopefully we're looking at positive things as well as negative things. We're looking at things like curiosity, grooming, play, comfort behaviors, positive social behaviors. More often than not, we're looking at the negative, but these are important indicators. We've got a good understanding of sickness and pain behavior. Aggression is a very, very important one, as we see, especially in pigs, in group house pigs, area that I've worked on a lot. Injurious behaviors such as tail biting, feather pecking, stereotypic behaviors we see a lot of in inadequate environments, fear behavior. So behavior gives us a good base for welfare assessment. And again, but all of these are going to, can be scored on this continuum of very good, very poor. And when you go in and measure behavior, all these different behaviors across, it's very rare that you wouldn't expect them to all be at the same level at the same time. Certain systems, like if we think about group housing for pigs, for example, the big argument is, if we're looking at a very dynamic system where we're mixing in lots of pigs all the time, we're going to find that we've got high aggression, and so aggression is going to score poorly on that continuum. Whereas at the same time, if they've got access to maybe an outdoor area and they can forage or straw in deep bedded pens, they can carry out a lot of foraging behavior, it's going to score highly on that. So within any given system, you're going to get different scores across the different measures that you're taking. The other area that William Thorpe focused on in that appendix was physiology, and that's been another absolute classic measure for a long time in terms of welfare assessment. we've been looking at the activation of those stress axes, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the sympathetic adrenomedullary axis. And so looking at the activation of those, either taking direct measures from blood in the olden days, but more so looking at things like cortisol now, rather than having to take blood samples, we can take saliva samples, we can take non-invasive type measures, we can take hair samples, we can look at fecal samples, for example. So we're beginning to get more sensitive and less invasive measures of activation of these axes. Things like heart rate variability, so looking at patterns within the heart rate can give us an idea of which axis is being activated within the sympathetic nervous system. Lots of physiological indicators that we can look at. So those have really been the key two areas: behavior and physiology. More recently, like I said, we're starting to think about that mental state. And when you think about mental state, you can think about it in terms of this type of system. We've got quadrants. So if you think about arousal, whether it's very high arousal or low arousal, and then whether it's going to be positive in valence or negative. So if you're highly aroused, so that's one of the measures, one of the issues we might have with measuring just heart rate, for example. Okay, heart rate goes up with high arousal. Well, then the difficulty is, is it due to excitement or is it due to fear? When we start looking at heart rate variability and patterns within that, we can begin to kind of tease apart whether it's a positive or negative. But sometimes if we look at just those main measures, and in fact cortisol, can be a dubious measure as well, because cortisol can go up with things like excitement. It can go up if you're much more active, cortisol will be high. And in a lot of systems, actually, we want to improve activity. And so if we've got more active animals and the cortisol goes up, cortisol is not necessarily a good measure in terms of response to stress. But this idea of valence, again, with low arousal, maybe you're in a positive valence, you're calm and relaxed. Heart rate's going to be low, those systems are going to be low, arousal is going to be low, but at the same time, sadness, depression, you can also see similar things in terms of the high-low arousal scale, but differences in that direction. And so physiological measures become quite difficult when we start thinking about that activation of those axes in terms of these quadrants. Health and disease always, of course, has been a popular one with veterinarians. We can think about mortality, morbidity, injuries, immune measures, pathologies. We can do a lot of blood diagnostics. So health and disease can give us a whole lot of indicators of welfare. Productivity indicators, of course, this is always the dangerous one, and the one that you hear so often, my animals, would not grow as well, would not produce as much milk, if their welfare was bad. We've always heard those kind of arguments in terms of supporting the very, very intensive systems, where productivity measures would seem to indicate that the system is working very, very well. What we do know is that, animals will maximize things like growth and productivity in situations where welfare is not good. And so it's really not as a standalone measure. We never take productivity as a standalone measure for good welfare. We can certainly take it as a measure for bad welfare, but for good, it's a dangerous thing to take. Beginning to look at affective states, some of the early ones were pain, beginning to look at things like grimace scales, the grimace scales in rats and mice, and now they're being kind of used in a lot of species, or at least being looked at in a lot of species. Some species it's very, very hard to get a good measure of this, but they're working. Judgment bias is one that has received an awful lot of attention. Again, this is work out of Mike Mendel's lab. So Mike Mendel was a postdoc in Don Broom's group at Cambridge when I was there. A really good scientist, and he's come up with a lot of unique ways of measuring welfare. This was one of his. Again, so you train an animal to approach the ends of the scale. So in this case, we've got black and white. So you can reward the animal for going to the positive, okay, and no reward for going to the negative. You train them over time, and then what you do is start presenting what we call ambiguous probes. So rather than completely white, well, it's a light shade of grey now, or rather than completely black, it's a dark shade of grey. And you then see whether the animal will approach. And if the animal is more, you might have seen these types of words and talking about optimism, pessimism. So if the animal is in a good frame of mind, when you're depressed, you tend to be much more negative. When you're not depressed, you seem to be much more positive and optimistic. And so this idea is, say, for example, hypothetically, you've had sows coming out of group systems versus coming out of gestation crates. If you trained them to the positive and negative, and then you give them these ambiguous probes, you would hope to see that the sows out of group housing would be more optimistic and would be more likely to approach some of these ambiguous probes. Whereas those sows that might be coming out of gestation crates, you might expect to be in a more negative affective state, and they will be less likely to approach. Maybe they'll approach this one, but they're not going to go and approach any of these ones. And so no, that's not right. So they might just approach this one and not approach the lighter coloured ones, whereas the optimistic sows might approach more, even the lighter coloured ones. That's right. So it's a very clever way of trying to get an idea of how that animal feels. And another one, qualitative behavioural assessment. So this is work done by Françoise Wemelsfelder at Scottish Rural University College. And she believes, and I think has shown quite well, that actually you can get an idea of that mental state of the animal by measuring its behavior in terms of qualitative terms. So what you're doing is thinking about, when she first started out, it used to very much be, she'd give a sheet of paper to somebody and say, just describe the behavior of that animal. And so if you've got a pig in a pen of straw and it was running around doing things, you would just write down words that you thought that animal was feeling, like, happy, excited, playful. Likewise, an animal within a barren pen with nothing to play with might be sad, inactive, depressed. Use whatever words you want to use to describe it. She then worked on that, and now we've got kind of scoring sheets where the words to describe a feeling will be written down, and the idea is that you would then, as you see down here, just be scoring them, writing a line on a scale of minimum to maximum where you think the animal might sit on this scale according to that word. And so a list of words, positive and negative, and then you're scoring the animal relative to its behavior, literally just watching it behave and scoring it. And this is shown to actually be a pretty good way of being able to measure and distinguish between animals' behavior in different environments. And it doesn't need you to be a scientist necessarily, or even somebody who is an expert in the animal that you're assessing. She's shown that experts as well as lay people can use this and can give a kind of active reflection of how that animal is likely feeling within a given situation. So that's a really exciting tool that is used as well. And so when you've got all these measures, you know, and here we have maybe two hypothetical systems, and you're thinking that, you know, our black is one system, our red is the other system. We've got these range of measures, and then you've still got the problem or the issue of coming up with an overall kind of score. You know, if we think about, from my point of view, you know, I'm used to that classic argument of gestation crates versus group systems. If you took all these measures and then we're trying to come up with that overall welfare assessment of whether welfare of sows was better in groups or gestation crates, where you put that overall assessment can vary depending on where you place emphasis within some of these. So, for example, I don't like to say veterinarians might think this, but veterinarians might very definitely think that, you know, health is very, very, very important. And if you're, say, for example, a swine veterinarian, you're going to think health is very important, productivity is very important. Therefore, I'm going to score red as the overall better system. You know, well, red might well be gestation crates in that instance. Of course, if I come in from a different point of view, I might well be putting my emphasis on something very different. I might think that actually, you know, to me, if we're talking about the mental state of the animal, and this one is really, really getting low down there in gestation crates, I believe that, you know, the evidence has shown that affective state is poor for sows in gestation crates. It's worse for behavior, it's worse for physiology, that these ones definitely outdo the smaller discrepancies in crates versus groups, and from my point of view, I find that groups are more welfare friendly than gestation crates, for example. So even though we take all these measures, you know, there's still at some point almost a bit of a subjective overall assessment based on the different weights we give to the different welfare indicators that we've measured. So it's still not a simple process. And many of these measures are only practical in controlled experiments on limited numbers of animals. Welfare assessment on farm is increasingly important for things like assurance schemes, which I'm now about to get into in my new job. But that presents difficulties because we don't have control. You know, we can't go in and take blood samples. We've got huge quantities of animals on the same farm. We're going to have to take subsets and get some kind of idea of how we can assess welfare. There's been two major European Union funded projects, one called Welfare Quality, one called AWIN, Animal Welfare Indicators Project. And these have been sort of tackling that problem that we have in terms of on-farm welfare assessment. And what we're beginning to try and come up with, a lot of the early welfare assessment was very much based on these kind of things, management and resource-based indicators. You know, when you're thinking about, well, they're measuring stocking density, for example, or space allowance. They're measuring, you know, the amount of feeding space per animal. They're measuring the number of drinkers in the pen. They're measuring whether there's straw bedding or not, those kind of things. So those are management and resource-based indicators. Well, they're really the inputs. What the welfare quality and the AWIN projects are more interested in is this idea of what are the welfare outputs, and so thinking about animal-based indicators. Coming back to those kind of freedoms and domains, again, those principles of good feeding, housing, health, appropriate behavior, and then looking at those welfare criteria. And we're beginning to think about certain things which are, you know, so blue for this example is going to be an animal-based measure. Age of weaning is going to be a management-based measure. The water supply, numbers of drinkers, for example, is going to be a resource-based measure. So we've got different coloured kind of outcomes, some of which are animal, some of which are not. And we want to really increase the number of animal-based measures that we include, because that's the important thing, is what are these inputs having, what impact are these inputs having on the outputs, which is the animals themselves. And so just to go through again, good housing, again, we've got good animal-based measures here for the pigs. Space allowance and use of farrowing crates is going to be management-based. Good health, lots of animal-based measures in our health, some management-based measures in our in these other measures. Again, appropriate behaviour is all going to be animal-based measures, and again, here we see that qualitative behavioural assessment has been used within the welfare quality scoring to give an idea of that positive emotional state of the animals. Now I'm running out of time, and so this one is just the same again on the AWIN, but with sheep. So again, looking at lots of different things that all move towards that getting assessment of good feeding, good housing, good health. Again, trying to focus on animal-based measures. So that's really where we're up to. I guess thinking for the future, a lot of work going on in terms of precision livestock farming, for example. So this idea that, you know, we need tools to help us with that assessment and monitoring of animals. Always very, very clear that PLF, precision livestock farming technology, should not be a replacement for good old-fashioned husbandry, but are there ways to use it to help gather information so that the human is still making all those decisions, and being able to more easily, you know, check on individual animals that might get flagged up by the automatic scoring systems. And this whole field is moving very, very quickly. And of course, we're beginning to at least see individual animal measures when we think about things like dairy cattle, beginning to see individual measures on things like pigs, but poultry, you know, we're still a long way off being able to think about individual measures for poultry, especially on the scale that intensive production is happening as it is at the moment. And I think that is my last slide. So I've at least we've got a few minutes left to answer some questions, I hope. And feel free to reach out to me here if you have questions that don't get answered today.
Thank you. Also, I love painting of your pig on your wall. Just been wanting to say that for a second. But there is one question in the chat so far from Susan, said, how do you educate people about how animals are raised for food when they don't want to hear it?
Well, when they don't want to hear it, well, that's pretty difficult when they don't want to hear it, because you're right. I mean, there's this thing called, you know, cognitive dissonance, and you know, a lot of people, yeah, really don't want to hear it. I mean, I don't know how we keep you know, because we can give people access to all the information. You know, there's a lot more effort put onto kind of the labeling within the sort of certified assurance schemes, at least, trying to, you know, label the food, that you can even, you know, scan a QR code to go back to get information on the farm that animal was raised on, for example. But those are, of course, those are within the high welfare type schemes, you know, where the care and hopefully housing of the animals is somewhat better than the standard housing of the animals. It's a difficult one, I think, also because, you know, the messenger gets pigeonholed as well. So if the message is coming from places like, you know, PETA or the Humane Society, for example, then it's sometimes that it's, you know, that messenger is less listened to as well. And of course, farmers, you know, when you talk to farmers, a lot of farmers will say that they need to tell the public what they're doing and why they're doing it. You know, farmers themselves will often, certainly within the pig industry, are very clear that they think that, the public would actually be supportive of the way that animals are raised and the treatments that they undergo. So it would be easy to, it would be quite nice to actually get the, if you really think that, then why are you not having those kind of why are you not educating the public yourselves? If you're feeling so under pressure by the lobby groups that that are trying to show the public what you do, and you're sitting there saying that, well, we should be showing the public what we do because we do it for a reason. They're not really engaged in that, but it's a difficult one, I think, because how do you force somebody to look at something that they don't want to look at and to pay attention? I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Oops, sorry. I'm gonna. Hello, I'm right now. A couple of questions, and I don't feel free to share as much or as little as you want, but I just, if you're down to tell more of the story about the research that you did during COVID-19 and sort of the pushback that you got from that research, or your paper that you published.
Mm-hmm.
How much can you talk about that? But
yeah, I can talk about it. I can certainly talk about it now, Crystal. It's fine. Yeah, so in the middle of COVID, just as as all the slaughterhouses started shutting down and we started seeing issues within the production chain, I wrote a paper talking about the impact of COVID as what we would call a one welfare issue. So I'm sure you're probably familiar with this concept of one health, in that the health of humans, animals, and the planet are all kind of interrelated. We can definitely think Rebecca Garcia kind of took that forward and talked about one health, one welfare as well. If we think about the welfare of humans, animals, and the planet are closely related. And I wrote a paper to say that what has been happening with COVID has really shown it to be a one welfare issue, in that as soon as those slaughterhouses started shutting down, for a start, it was a one health, it was a human welfare issue for those working within the slaughterhouses. But it's also then started being a animal welfare issue. That production chain is so tightly wound, is so ramped up and running at full capacity, that as soon as we saw anything happen to disrupt that chain, we see impacts in both directions. And the argument was that you could see effects on animals. Obviously, we in the worst case scenario, we did have to have some depopulation back on farm because there was nowhere for those animals to move to in terms of slaughter. And then the disposal of that obviously has an environmental impact. But the people very definitely working in the slaughterhouse were under a lot of pressure, and their welfare was not good. And in writing that paper, I got an official reprimand from my employer at the time, who was the USDA, for talking about some of the data that I included in that, looking at slaughter line speeds, for example, for poultry, and finding that the relationship, the more poultry slaughterhouses that get exemptions from the speed, that are allowed to speed up the slaughter lines, the less condemned meat we were seeing coming out of slaughterhouses. So not surprisingly, if you speed up the line, the meat inspectors can't inspect as well, and less condemned meat. Well, it's not because suddenly food hygiene is getting better. It's because they haven't got time to do their inspections anymore. And so that was 2 bunches of USDA data, which also got published in this paper, which, of course, not surprisingly, was not very well looked at by my USDA employers at the time. So that was kind of it in a nutshell, I guess.
Well, thank you for answering that question. If anyone has any other questions, do you want to send your email in the chat? I know it was on that last slide, but just so it's in text form. But if anyone has any questions, could they reach out to you by chance? And also, if you have any questions are honor related, I posted our email in the chat a little bit up, along with some other information. And make sure to fill out the form if you need a CE credit. That is like 4 messages up if you didn't see that. But yeah,
If you have
thank
like
you so much.
2 more seconds, one more kind of question I'd like to ask is, like, now with your new role at Gap, what do you see as like the kind of the most important issue, or some of the most important issues that we should kind of focus our efforts on to improve farm animal welfare?
I mean, I certainly think the poultry industry is one where we probably need biggest immediate change. You know, I think in some ways they've kind of flown below the radar a bit. You know, that the average life of the average broiler chicken it's very short, I know, but in terms of quality of life, I think it's pretty low. You know, if we thought about that slide where I had a good life, a life worth living, and not a good life, I would say the broiler chicken is probably, you know, down low on that. You know, and that's a numbers game as well. Certainly from a kind of effective altruism point of view and open philanthropy, I mentioned them. You know, they're funding where they're funding in the industries where the numbers are. And so they're thinking about the welfare of poultry especially, and they're thinking about the welfare of fish as well, because that's another one where, you know, outside of, or probably even inside of commercial farming of fish, but outside, when we think about fishing as a whole, you know, we don't even know the numbers of fish that are involved. You know, it's purely given in tons. You know, we have no idea of the number of fish that are impacted, both from commercial fishing and farming. So, you know, unfortunately, you know, the bigger the animal and the less there are in terms of number, you know, if you genuinely want to start impacting in terms of numbers of animals, then poultry and fish are where it's at, and the bigger animals are going to be lower down on the list of priorities from that point of view. Yeah, but I mean, but really, Crystal, you know, when you think about it, you know, if the avian influenza, you know, the way that chickens are thought of, avian influenza alone should again tell you that, you know, the outcry, if those were dairy cows in those numbers that were being depopped, you know, this would be a daily part of conversation, I'm sure. You know, the fact that they're chickens is, again, you know, it's the poor old chicken gets pretty low priority, you know, and yet the numbers are just unbelievable, really.
It looks like Crystal might have gotten pulled away.
She was kind of busy by the looks of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it did look that way. But yeah, it is just after 1 o'clock. I don't see any other questions. A couple thank yous, and again, thank you for presenting. But I don't see any other questions right now, so I think it's safe to wrap it up. Again, really appreciate you coming in and talking to us.
Yeah, very welcome.
And I hope you have a great day, and everybody on the call, I hope you have a great day as well.
Thanks.